So when we study food web and food chain, we just picture the fact that energy is getting transferred from one trophic level to another. But that is just not the case, because along with energy, whatever substances that is there in one trophic level gets also transferred, and this becomes of concern to us because along with this consumption, one other thing that is passing through different trophic levels are your pollutants. So the next thing that we have to discuss are about two terms that get constantly misunderstood. There is something called as bioaccumulation and there is something called as biomagnification. And both of these processes become relevant when there is a movement of pollutants through your different trophic levels. And how is it moving through different trophic levels? That is along with the consumption of nutrients. Okay, so now what we have to look into what are these terms, and to understand these terms, let's have a look at a picture which is there. So we have two concepts, bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation, accumulate, that means to collect over time. Okay, now to collect over time means what? We are to study bioaccumulation, we're just looking to a group of specific set of organisms. Now here if you look at it, you have three small fish, and it's the three smaller fish which is grown on to become like these bigger fishes over here. That means with the time, with their growth, something is happening to the pollutants that they are carrying. And here is where you understand bioaccumulation primarily means here in the same set of organisms, what is happening is pollutants are getting stored again and again and again, and as they are growing from their childhood to your bigger stages, the amount of pollutants that are there in their body is also getting higher. So now the question comes, how has it happened that way? Now it has happened that way obviously because whatever is a smaller organism from its small times onwards, maybe the food that it is consuming has some amount of pollutants. So let's assume these shark-like creatures are consuming some shrimp or prawn or something. So in those creatures, if there are pollutants, and if these animals or these fishes over here, they are constantly dependent on those prawn or shrimp for the diet. So what happens is they'll keep eating that same thing, and ideally what should happen, they'll keep eating the same thing and somehow it should get excreted out of the body, right? Because see, in every creature which is there, it has an excretory system. So if there's something unwanted in the body of the creature, it should get excreted out. But somehow, in this case, it's not getting excreted out, it's just getting accumulated in the body. So much so that over the passage of time, as it keeps eating that diet, what happens? There is more and more and more of it inside the body of those creatures. So two things are clear to us over here. It is not getting excreted out, and bioaccumulation is defined with respect to the same set of organisms. We are not bringing in a different group of organisms over here. We are looking at the same set of organisms that has accumulated pollutants in it over the time. So this becomes a cause of concern as to why is it not getting excreted out. And that is where you come to the conclusion that those pollutants which enter the body, those pollutants are primarily fat loving, or what you say, fat, the kind of pollutants that can get stored in your fat muscles. So you will see over here that it must be having these kind of pollutants which is happening over there in the body of a bioaccumulant. You will see that these are very long lasting, and it is soluble in fats and non soluble in water. Now, this is a problematic thing because in any of our bodies, if excretion has to happen in a considerably good manner, what has to happen? It should be, or whatever that pollutant is, or whatever that toxin is, it should be soluble in water. Only then can it be run out of the body. But if it's not soluble in water, that is the first problem, because it is not having any method by which it can be taken to the excretory system. The next problem is it's not soluble in water, but it's soluble in fats. And every organism which has adipose tissue content. Adipose tissue primarily means your fat tissue content which is there. What happens? It gets soluble over there, and the fat is not burnt constantly from the body, which means it gets accumulated in the body. This is what you have to keep in mind. So when I'm saying bioaccumulation and I just told you it is not excreted out, you know that is because this is fat soluble and it remains in the body of that species or that organism for a very long time. Okay, so if that is bioaccumulation, then you have another concept called as biomagnification. And biomagnification is something where you will see across the trophic levels. Magnify means what? Something that was small, you put a magnifying thing and it becomes larger. Okay, it seems larger when you put a magnifying glass, but in biomagnification, what actually happens is, from the smaller organism, as we cross through different trophic levels, what again happens? The amount of pollutant that exists in a higher organism is more and more in comparison to a smaller organism. Okay, why again does this happen? This happens primarily because, see, the smaller organism maybe, which is over here, might be having a consumption of smaller things, grass or something, and it gets the pollutant in trace amounts. This organism is not eating just one of this prawn or one of this krill which is there. This organism will eat several hundreds of it, which means all of that pollutant enters into this one's body. Now, this organism which is here, it will not just eat one of these fishes, it will eat more and more of these fishes. So what happens is, as you go higher up in the trophic level, their consumption increases, and when their consumption increases, what again happens over here is that more and more pollutant gets accumulated into the body of that creature. So you notice me, I just told the word accumulated over here. So can I basically define biomagnification as progressive bioaccumulation at each trophic level? Because bioaccumulation means that the same set of organisms are there, throughout their life cycle. But look at this. Now over here, these are the three fishes, or these are the three fishes which is getting consumed over here at this trophic level, which means the progressive bioaccumulation that happens over the trophic levels can also be defined as biomagnification. So now let's have a quick look at the definitions. Bioaccumulation means gradual accumulation of pollutants, chemicals and other substances in an organism. Then you have biomagnification, which is progressive bioaccumulation at each trophic level with the passage of time. And for any of this to occur, be it bioaccumulation or biomagnification, there are certain conditions for it to occur. The pollutant must have a long biological life. It must not be soluble in water, and it must be soluble in fats. Such example is your DDT. Okay, so now with that, we are moving on to the next part that we have to discuss, which is your biogeochemical cycles. I would say when it comes to the static parts, we are at level 3 of difficulty right now, and once you cross your biogeochemical cycles, you're done. You've crossed the level 3 too. So let's get into what the biogeochemical cycle says. See, primarily in any kind of ecosystem, if functions have to happen in a good manner, if services have to be created, and products have to be maintained, what has to happen? There should be a regular exchange of nutrients from abiotic factors to biotic factors, between biotic factors. They have to keep on exchanging these different nutrients, gases, minerals, etc. And the cyclic manner in which this kind of an exchange happens is called as biogeochemical cycles. The important types of biogeochemical cycles are, you have something called as a gaseous cycle, and then you have something called as a sedimentary cycle. When it comes to a gaseous cycle or sedimentary cycle, in the case of the gaseous cycle, the core gas or the core element that keeps on getting recycled, the source of that element will be your atmosphere. For example, take oxygen. Okay, where do you have the source of this, or the major source of it from? You have it in the atmosphere. More than the lithosphere or the hydrosphere, you have oxygen in your, the surrounding areas which is there. So in the atmosphere which is there. So the gaseous cycle would be those where the reservoir of that element is in the atmosphere or the hydrosphere, and sedimentary cycle is where the reservoir is in the Earth's crust. Phosphorus, sulfur, calcium, magnesium. Obviously, sedimentary cycles are considered to be much more slower than your gaseous cycle, because sedimentary cycle involves much more time consuming processes like weathering, fragmentation, mineralization, etc. Okay, now with that, let's have a look at the most important cycles that are there. Your general carbon dioxide cycle and everything is something that's quite easy to understand. One thing, most of the times you just have to keep in mind to the fact that when it comes to carbon dioxide, the plants, like for a brief period, we won't be discussing carbon cycle in detail. The reason being that it's one of the most simplest cycles that you can study. You don't have to bother too much about it. We'll go detail into the nitrogen cycle, but in the case of the carbon dioxide, see, even in the classes I've told you that, okay, whenever you get any kind of cycle, try to divide it on the basis of from where something is getting released. If something is getting released or something is getting taken up. Okay, so when it comes to taken up, means it will be utilized, released means it will be given out. So what are the processes which would be releasing your carbon dioxide? Obviously, when we respire, respiration in your animals and plants, what happens over there? We take in oxygen, we give out carbon dioxide. So respiration, we release carbon dioxide. What about photosynthesis? Photosynthesis means what? The plant takes in carbon dioxide and releases out oxygen. So taken in or taken up, you can see photosynthesis. When fossil fuels are burnt, what happens? Do carbon dioxide get released or carbon dioxide gets taken up? Here, in the case of burning of fossil fuels, carbon dioxide is released. What about volcanic eruptions? If there are any volcanic eruptions, what happens? Carbon dioxide is released. Okay, so broadly you can have this picture in mind that will help you solve carbon dioxide or carbon cycle related questions. Now let's go into the nitrogen cycle, because we have a ton of bacteria and fungus and everything that we have to discuss when it comes to the nitrogen cycle. See, nitrogen cycle gets too complicated for the reason being that the atmospheric nitrogen which is present, it is present in the form of a very strong bond. Okay, so when I'm saying N2, which is the elemental form of nitrogen, so what happens is those molecules are bound together with each other by strong forces, and you cannot just go and be like, okay, fine, I need to take some nitrogen, can you please come? That is not possible. Why? Because if I need nitrogen, I have to break the bonds between these N2 molecules. And this is the reason why breaking of these nitrogen bonds requires some amount of external activity. Okay, something has to be done, some extra energy has to be provided so that I can pull this nitrogen or these bonds apart. So that extra force can be maybe lightning, the extra force can be maybe some enzymes, chemicals that are there, whatever it is, something extra has to be brought in so that the nitrogen can be broken down, or as I can call it, the nitrogen can be fixed. Okay, so this process that is happening over here is basically the fixing of nitrogen, which primarily means the breaking of nitrogen bonds. Okay, let's start with the fact that you have certain plants called as your leguminous plants. They are not always seen everywhere, but when they are present, they become quite special for the reason being that in the roots of the leguminous plants, you have certain bacteria that occur in something. For example, if you have a root like this, they have small areas on the root called as root nodules, and inside the root nodules, you have nitrogen fixing bacteria. The good thing, because now I don't have to go and find out how I can fix the bacteria. If I'm having leguminous crops, becomes quite simple, because here what you will see is that, so what happens is in these root nodules, you have certain nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they are quite exemplary because they just take in this atmospheric nitrogen which is there, which is very difficult to break, and they, using their very strong enzymes, they just break it into simpler compounds, and those simpler compounds can be utilized by the plant. So this is a very good thing because there is no additional function or anything. If there's a leguminous plant, you have certain nitrogen fixing bacteria, and what is the name of that nitrogen fixing bacteria? It's called as rhizobium. Okay, so rhizobium is that bacteria which can directly take the atmospheric nitrogen and make it into simpler compounds directly that can be used by the plants. Okay, now obviously, as I told you, not all your areas have leguminous plants. You have a lot of normal plants. What about nitrogen for them? And this is where the elaborate nitrogen fixing process happens. And the elaborate nitrogen fixing process happens when you don't have, instead of leguminous plants, you have normal plants and everything, and in the soil you have to start breaking this nitrogen. In that case, what happens is atmospheric nitrogen, which is in this form, is taken up by a category of bacteria called as nitrogen fixing soil bacteria. Understand, these are not in the root nodules, these are just present in the soil. So the atmospheric nitrogen is taken by these soil bacteria. And what is the name of that soil bacteria? You can have different kinds over here. You have Azotobacter. You can have your Behemickia. Then there is Clostridium, Rhodospirillum. These pictures, in this picture, it is pretty detailedly given. You can use it for any kind of reference which is there. So I'll just write out the names, which is Azotobacter, Then there is Behemicea. Rhodospirillum. And Clostridium. Understand, these are all just your normal soil living bacteria. They easily break this atmospheric nitrogen, but not into the direct simple form, because as I told you, none of these are as powerful as your rhizobium. These guys break the atmospheric nitrogen into something called as your ammonia, NH4+. Okay, it is broken into something called as ammonium, not ammonia, ammonium. Okay, and this process, this first process is called as ammonification, where atmospheric nitrogen is broken down into NH4+. Okay, so if you are asked for given 3-4 names and you are asked to choose which is the ammonifying bacteria, bacteria that aids in ammonification, it's these guys. Okay, so it's Azotobacter, Behemicea, and Rhodospirillum and Clostridium. So whatever has now come out in the form of NH4, which is ammonium, now that has to be broken down, because that still cannot be used by the plants. So here what happens is, this NH4 is now broken down into something called as nitrites. Nitrites, that is NO2-. Again, a trick I used to tell in our classes, nitrites. Okay, so then I'll tell you the trick after I tell you the next step. So here you had ammonium, now you have nitrites. And this process is done by two major bacteria called as Nitrosomonas and Nitrococcus. Okay, so the conversion of ammonium into nitrites is done by two bacteria, which is Nitrosomonas and Nitrococcus. Still, it's not over. Why? Because in this state also the plant is not able to easily take it into its roots. So what happens over here? From the nitrite stage, it gets converted into your nitrate stage. NO3-. Okay, nitrate stage. Okay, and in this process, the bacteria that helps is called as Nitrobacter. Okay, Nitrobacter. So I just want you to also understand one more thing over here. Whenever whenever you have your ammonium stage and the ammonium is converted into nitrites or nitrates, this entire process is called as what? Nitrification. Just like this process was called as ammonification, this entire process is called as nitrification. So if they ask you which are the nitrifying bacteria, it's Nitrosomonas, Nitrococcus and Nitrobacter. But if they specifically ask you which are the bacteria that are converting nitrites into nitrates, then it is just your Nitrobacter. So keep this, be very careful when questions like that come. So with this process, what has happened is something that was in your atmospheric nitrogen state slowly gets broken down into ammonium, then nitrites, then nitrates, and at this stage, it can be very easily assimilated by the plants. Assimilated means it can be very easily dissolved in the water, it can be absorbed by the roots, and the plants can use it in a simple manner. So everything is good, everything is perfect. But as you can see, a cycle should have some method by which it gets completed. We started with nitrogen, we did this nitrate part, and the plant took it. When the plant takes it and then someone eats it and everything, obviously some ammonium and everything will come back into the soil. But there should be one more pathway whereby which this nitrate can be directly converted back into your atmospheric nitrogen, just to complete the balance of your gases which are there. And this is where there's an opposite process that happens, where at this stage, in this NO3 stage, which is your nitrate stage, this nitrate, some of it gets taken up by the plants, some of it gets converted back into your nitrogen. It gets converted back into your atmospheric nitrogen, and that process, my dear students, is called as your denitrification. Denitrification, and this is done by just two major bacteria called as, you have something called as Pseudomonas, and then you have something called as Theobacillus. Pseudomonas and Theobacillus, they are your denitrifying bacteria. The reason I try to remember this process over here is because when it comes to the conversion back into your denitrification, you will see that at that point alone, you have two bacteria, Pseudomonas and Theobacillus. So even if I remember just their names, I will know that, okay, this is an opposite process that is happening where it's converted back into atmospheric nitrogen. And at least I will be able to eliminate anything. If they, I'm pretty sure if they give you 4 options, they will put a Pseudomonas or Theobacillus in the nitrogen fixing process. So Theobacillus and Pseudomonas are not part of nitrogen fixing. They are part of sending back atmosphere, creating back atmospheric nitrogen. The fixing process, which is breaking down the bonds of nitrogen, is done by all of these other guys. Astobacter, Behemia, Rhodospirillum, Clostridium, Nitrosomonas, Nitrococcus, Nitrobacter, then you have Rhizobium. All of them do nitrogen fixing, but Pseudomonas and Theobacillus does the opposite process. So keep have an idea about it. Now just to have another picture over here, so this completes one cycle. Now apart from that also, when you have the decomposition of something, or when you have the creation of something dies off, or there's excretion from animals, in all of those processes, what happens? Nitrogen gets back into the soil in the form of ammonium, in the form of nitrites, nitrates, etc., and can be broken down by decomposer organisms. Okay, in that way also nitrogen's balance is maintained in the soil and in the atmosphere. Okay, so I hope this part is quite clear. Now, okay, so one thing I want to discuss when it comes to this, it's not a current affair, but then something that you have to be aware of. We are studying nitrogen cycle, and that is ideally when nitrogen and everything is in balance. Okay, but as you know, due to several processes like overuse of fertilizers, burning of fossil fuels, etc., there is an excess of nitrogen that is present in your atmosphere, to the case where it is now creating something called as your nitrogen pollution. Okay, and this is a severe problem that is there, and several treaties and everything are being brought in to curb this. India is spearheading certain things also, but I want to say, talk about a treaty that India is not part of, and that is important because we hear a lot of these treaties coming up, and this is something that India is not part of. And just keep this term in mind, because even if they ask a lot of other ones, you might take a guess that India is part of it, but the one that India is not part of it is easier to remember in comparison to that. So you have a convention on long range transboundary pollution. Long range transboundary pollution is primarily to deal with those kind of pollutants that can be present in your atmosphere. It cannot be easily, readily curbed, etc. And as part of this convention on long range transboundary pollution, nitrogen pollution, sulfur pollution, all of these pollutions are being tackled. This is a convention that is created by Europe, Russia and the Eastern Bloc, and you will see that India is not part of it. Okay, the prominent treaties or the prominent protocols that have come under this convention is, you have something called as your Gothenburg Protocol, you have the Sofia Protocol, etc. These protocols, none of these protocols India is part of. So even if they ask you a simple question about Gothenburg or Sofia, etc., understand India is not part of the convention on long range transboundary pollution. So it doesn't make any sense that the treaties that are formed under it or the protocols that are formed under it, India will be part of. No. So India is not part of any of these protocols. So just keep that in mind. Now we move into a much more relatively simple cycle, I would say, your sulfur cycle. And when it comes to the sulfur cycle, one of the important things that you have to just keep in your mind is the fact that be it sulfur or be it your phosphorus cycle, the important thing is it is more or less your sedimentary cycles. And I would say, in comparison to sulfur, phosphorus is a much more sedimentary form of cycle, because a lot of the major sources of phosphorus are from your lithosphere itself. Sulfur at least has some byproducts that can be found in your atmosphere, etc. But in the case of phosphorus, is purely mostly a sedimentary cycle. This is also the reason why if they give you, sulfur and nitrogen and carbon and phosphorus and ask you which is the slowest of all of these cycles, it will be phosphorus. Okay. Now coming back to this point over here, the sulfur cycle, I just have an intuition that this could be important. Okay. Because conventionally there has been a question from your biogeochemical cycles in alternate years, and I do feel sulfur is important. Again, don't ask me. It's a intuitive thing that I am telling you. So let's have a look at sulfur anyway. Sulfur can be present in the form of fossil fuels. Sulfur can be present in the form of your gypsum, pyrite, etc., those kind of sediments. Sulfur can also be present in the form of, or you have sulfur which is free in the soil. Then you can have, let's just take these three processes. Fossil fuels, direct burning can release sulfur. Fossil fuels, when they are, then other processes, it's mined, then it's converted, and then you have your sulfur dioxide getting formed. That is also another way. Then you have, when it comes to your gypsum, pyrite, etc., those are converted. So if this is sulfur dioxide, gypsum is converted into hydrogen sulfides when it is being used in different processes. Some sulfur that's present in the soil is converted by microorganisms into sulfates. Okay, that's the same similar processes do happen in your water also. Volcanic eruptions can cause your sulfate and sulfur dioxide. So I would primarily say, if a question does come, understand sulfur is always released into the atmosphere in a compound form of sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, sulfates, etc. Okay, this is one way it gets released. And another way it comes back onto the earth is you have processes like your acid rain, etc., where it mixes with the moisture and again comes back onto the earth. Whatever it is, the primary source of sulfur is your lithosphere. Just keep remembering that. Primary source is your lithosphere. Okay, so I hope that part is clear. If you've done with these cycles, you have now crossed level 3, and I would say let's have a quick thing from the beginning. What has happened? We've discussed the different terms associated with your environment. We've moved on to pyramids and such stuff. We've discussed ecological succession, ecocline, ecotone, edge effect and everything. And now we've moved on to biogeochemical cycles, biomagnification, all of those concepts. And we are right now, the hardcore static part of your environment ends over here. Now it's those areas which have an overlap with static and current affairs that we will be discussing from now onwards. So moving on to the level 4 of your environment static area. As I told you, hardcore static is by now done. Now what we have is, I would say, it's much more areas that you have overlap with your geography and everything. You would have maybe already covered it in geography also. So we'll have a quick roundup of this session, of this level which is there. I hope you're all on track right now. Now coming on to environment, we have to discuss a few things about certain biomes which are there, and the most common terrestrial biomes are your forest, grassland, mountains and desert. Out of this itself, I have a particular interest towards forest over here, the reason being that we have a lot of current affairs associated with it also, which we'll be discussing in the coming hours which are there. But as of now, one important thing that you have to keep in mind is when it comes to the biomes of forest, I hope you've already covered in geography the different types of forest and everything, the deciduous, tropical deciduous and all of that has been done, evergreen and all of those features. From the environment side of it, understand that in India, there has been a regular counting of forests that happens, and this is called as your Forest Survey of India. Forest Survey of India started publishing a biennial state of forest report since 1987. But understand, even prior to that, from the early 1980s itself, they had started mapping the forests in India. Now, when I'm saying the forests, it's not a very easy term to define. There is a clear difference between what India considers as forests and what United Nations, or in a global level, what they consider as forest. And I do see a question scope over here, so pay attention here. When we count forest in our country, we are counting all plots of 1 hectare or above with at least 10% tree canopy density, irrespective of land use or ownership within the forest cover. Which means any land area 1 hectare or more which has 10% canopy density is categorized as forest in India. Now, if that forest is something that you're maybe you haven't you have 1 hectare of land with 10% tree canopy density, and you are growing oranges over there, you're growing apples over there, and you're using it for the purpose of export or whatever purpose, it's farming that is happening. Even that is included as forest in India. Okay, so keep that in mind. We do not exclude those areas based on land use or ownership. Land use means what? Even if it's used for agriculture purposes, even if it's used for social forestry, even if it's used for farm forestry or agroforestry, we categorize it as forest. This is not how it is done globally. On the United Nations benchmark, it does not include areas predominantly under agricultural and urban land use under forests. Got it? So keep this differentiation in mind. If they ask you, we are following the global standards. No, we have our own standards, because in India, there's a lot of areas where you have people coexisting with forest, having their agriculture related to the forest, etc. So you cannot go and suddenly be like, okay, fine, we will not count you at all, because it's a forest, but it's used for certain other purposes also. Okay, so now when it comes to the forest survey, we've discussed this. I want you to understand that we have to also discuss the forest state of forest report of 2023, because that's the last report that is there, and that will be discussed in the current affairs part. Now let's move on to certain aquatic ecosystems that we have to discuss. Now in the aquatic ecosystems, understand broadly, you can divide things into freshwater ecosystems and marine ecosystems, and this definition is done based on the salinity that exists over there. And before we go into the saline part, I just want you to see this diagram which is there. Based on what levels of the marine ecosystem is being occupied, you have different creatures that have the name of Neuston, plankton, nekton, benthon, etc. We have to discuss that in detail. And we also have to discuss some features of your aquatic ecosystems. So let's go into the environmental side of these aquatic ecosystems. Now, when it comes to the different components of aquatic ecosystem, your aquatic ecosystem, as you know, has both your biotic, abiotic compounds. You have plants, you have animals, you have minerals, you have gases. The gases in the aquatic ecosystem are in a dissolved state. Okay, so the gases are necessary because you do have producers which are green plants even in the aquatic ecosystems, and they need to prepare food so that the food chain actually goes about in the aquatic ecosystems also. But aquatic ecosystems do have certain constraints. Okay, one of the first constraints is the light part of it. As you know, the entire column of your aquatic ecosystem does not receive light in an equal manner. Obviously, at the top surface, you will get good amount of light, but as you go further and further and further down, the amount of light that is received becomes lesser. Based on how much light is received, you have two zones, or your entire aquatic ecosystem column can be divided into two parts, which is photic zone and aphotic zone. Photic, and then you have something called as aphotic zone. Okay, so let's have a look over here. If I am showing you the photic zone, from the surface up till 200 meters into the depth is your photic zone. Beyond your 200 meters to almost your lower ends, which is your 10,000, 6,000, those areas which is over there, this is completely called as aphotic zone. So understand what has happened over here is you had light at the surface, gradually the light reduces. Here it's quite well lit. Here around 200 meter to 1000 meters and everything, 1000 to 4000 meters, this area is called as twilight zone, not the movie, just it's very dim light. Okay, beyond your twilight zone, it's actually there's no light, absolutely no light. So that is somewhere between your 1000 to 4000 meters to even further down, there is absolutely no light. Okay, so here you can see in a very clear manner. Here, when it's divided into photic zone and aphotic zone, where do you think would be the highest photosynthetic activity? The photosynthetic activity in your aquatic zones is confined only to the photic zone, which means from the surface up till a depth of 200 meters downwards is the only area where you have photosynthetic activity. Beyond that, you don't see photosynthetic activity. This is the first thing. Okay. Second thing, so oxygen, I mean the light part we have just understood, like, you know, you have photic and aphotic. Now coming to the oxygen part. It becomes difficult for aquatic ecosystems, or aquatic ecosystems are generally, they don't have, if you look at it on the land, you have your Amazon rainforest, you have so many forested areas, you have so much of production happening, productivity happening from your green plants. But in the aquatic ecosystems, it's unable to be that productive, because in the aquatic ecosystems, the gases, be it oxygen or carbon dioxide, are in its dissolved state. Now, when I'm saying dissolved state, understand the oxygen which is there in the aquatic ecosystems is actually 150 times lower than the concentration of oxygen that is there in the volume of air, like it's there in the air, normally in the air. So when you compare air and water, the amount of oxygen, you can say, yeah, oxygen is dissolved, but the concentration even after oxygen gets dissolved is so less that you don't see very lush vegetation growing in your aquatic ecosystems. So if you look at your oceans, you just have a 10 parts per million when it comes to oxygen, and it's actually very less in comparison to your column of air. And to make things worse, what also happens is, when water is warm, it contains less dissolved oxygen. This is a cause of concern for us right now, because you are seeing that the oceans, the water bodies and everything is warming up. Okay, because of global warming. So when you have global warming, what happens is it becomes difficult for oxygen to get dissolved in the water. And if oxygen is not dissolved in the water, what is going to happen? The life that is dependent on it will start perishing. So this is also an added disadvantage when it comes to the aquatic ecosystems. So these are the different components of aquatic ecosystems. Now you will see over here what are the different creatures, or what are the different kinds of organisms that are existing in aquatic ecosystems. You can broadly divide them into neustans, planktons, nectans and benthans. So let's have a look. Neustans are those organisms that live at air-water interface. Air-water interface is that primary surface which is over there. You have a lot of creatures which are there in that area, where most of it you would have free-floating plants, etc. So you have other organisms also, like you have other animal creatures, but mostly you do see a lot of floating plants. Then you have something called as planktons. We know of these creatures called as phytoplanktons, zooplanktons, etc. You will see over here that these phytoplanktons, zooplanktons, these creatures are also, they don't occur at the air-water interface. They are in the lower part to the air-water interface, but these are tiny creatures, so much so that they just flow along wherever the water is going. If the water is churning upside down, they will flow up with it. If its water is going this side, it will just go with it, because it does not have so much big fins and everything that it can go against the water flow. So planktons are those small creatures, small organisms that go along with the flow of water. And this is very important to understand, because when you have certain features like upwelling, you would have studied in geography, some features like upwelling. So the planktons are those creatures which are going along with the flow of water, and so this becomes important when we study features like upwelling, because you'll see that in upwelling, when there's a nutrient churn happening, it's these creatures which are actually getting upwelled in this, and based on where these phytoplanktons or zooplanktons are there, that is those areas where you can say that there's much more higher productivity in the oceans. Anyway, now moving on to the next category of organisms which are there. You have certain category of organisms called as nectins, and nectins are quite the opposite of planktons in a lot of ways. Why? Because planktons are small, nectins are a little bit more higher organisms, bigger organisms which are there. Planktons occur more towards your upper regions. Nectins are something that occurs throughout the column of your water areas which are there. But the important thing about nectins is, because these are higher organisms and bigger organisms, they can go against the flow of water. Okay, which means, like, you can see these bigger organisms over here. What happens to them is, water might be flowing in one way, they can resist the flow and can go in the direction that they want. So this is your next, and most of the aquatic organisms come under the category of nectins. Okay, then finally you have a category of organisms called as benthins. Benthins primarily means those organisms which get fixed on to the bed, the rock bed or the sand bed over here. So benthins are those organisms which are fixed on to the sea bed. Okay, fixed onto the sea bed. So with that, we have covered the important organisms also that are there in the aquatic ecosystems. Now we have to have a quick look through some of the important aquatic ecosystem features like your coral reefs, mangroves, kelp forest, etc. So let's start with the coral reefs, quite important from the UPSC point of view. Coral reefs, first of all, understand the entire feature of coral reefs. Let's ask a very simple question. Is it a plant or an animal? It looks like it is like a plant, but coral reef actually it belongs to the categorization of animal. What exactly is the animal part of it? Understand, these are features like in this manner. Okay, and it has small pores in between over here on each of its surfaces. These organisms are called as your polyps. Polyps. Now the problem with polyps is they are quite fixed in nature. They are stuck into one part. So unlike your normal animals, what happens is they cannot just walk around and catch their food or anything. They are fixed to certain areas. And this is where it becomes important that if they are fixed somewhere, they need food in some manner, right? And this is where one mechanism, again remember this is not the only mechanism in which coral reefs function. One mechanism where they try to get their food is by having a very mutualistic friendship or a symbiotic relation. Mutualism, symbiotism, you understand that. This is somewhere where both the organisms are positively impacted. So they get into this friendship with this algae called as your zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae. And this algae, you can see over here, this algae is quite, useful in the fact that obviously it's an algae, so it will produce food. Whatever food it produces, it shares with your coral reefs also. So that is fine. But on the other hand, so what happens over here is when you have your zooxanthellae, the zooxanthellae gives the food. And what does the zooxanthellae get in return? The zooxanthellae gets absolute protection from any kind of predators. It is very sheltered in these polyp areas. And to add to it, the zooxanthellae, because it has a presence and these algae release certain enzymes, what happens is the presence of zooxanthellae gives these coral reefs very exquisite colors also. So that's an added bonus. Okay. So on the whole, things are going good. But I want you to again remember, this is not the only type of coral in the world. There are several types of corals. One type of coral has zooxanthellae within it, and they find their food in this manner. As per Indian law, we will study the Indian law in detail, but understand, we are protecting coral polyps or coral reefs under the Schedule 1 of Wildlife Protection Act. Now moving on to this conditions of coral growth. Obviously, you might have maybe covered this in geography, so this will be like a quick revision for you. Understand that because the zooxanthellae is present inside the coral reefs, this becomes a much more picky, fussy organism. Why? Because the zooxanthellae is like, see, I'm giving you food, I'm giving you color and everything. So glow up and all has happened. So the point is, I need some very good conditions to live over here. What are the conditions? First condition, it should be stable climatic conditions. When I'm saying stable climatic conditions, understand that you cannot have areas where there is one day it's very hot, the next day it's very cold. So you cannot have that kind of a variation which is there. That's the first thing. Second thing is, you need perpetually warm waters if you want zooxanthellae to stay. Perpetually warm waters means what? You can see it only in that 30° north and south, between those 30° north and south latitudes, and the temperature of water should be around 20° Celsius. It cannot be too warm that it will be like, you know, burning hot. It needs to somewhere be around 20° Celsius, because beyond that temperature, if it gets higher, it will damage the zooxanthellae. Then the next point is, it should be shallow water. Shallow water means it cannot go to much deeper areas where there is much more depth. Ideally, maybe some 45 to 55 meters from the sea surface, where you need sunlight. Sunlight is important because the zooxanthellae needs to prepare its food. So shallow waters. Clear salt water. Clear salt water. You cannot have sediments. You cannot have completely fresh water, because salinity is also an important factor. So you need to have clear salt water, and then you also need to have little or no pollution. So no sediments. I hope from this it's quite clear that the zooxanthellae's conditions are very stringent, and if it is not there, what happens is the zooxanthellae will die off. And when the zooxanthellae dies off, what you will see over here is a process called as coral bleaching. What happens is, bleaching means what? You lose color of it. First, the zooxanthellae will start either getting killed or driven out slowly. When it's driven out in this manner, the coral will start losing its color, and as it starts losing its color, the first problem is not losing color. The bigger problem is the fact that there's nobody to feed the coral right now. Okay, because it was getting food from the zooxanthellae. So gradually what you see is, it will start bleaching, and very soon it will die off. Okay, the coral dies off, and this is a problematic thing. You know that the biggest coral reefs in the world, that is your Great Barrier Reef, every single, I would say in the past, at least for 5 times in the past 20 years, the Great Barrier Reef has undergone destructive activities. It was getting bleached, etc. Even in India, we do have coral reefs, okay, because India is in that perfect condition, right? The 30° north, 30° south, that we have warm waters, we have all of these conditions. So even in India, we do have coral reefs. We see coral reefs on the Gulf of Kutch side, the Malvan Islands. Here and close by over here in Karnataka, you also have the Netrani Islands. So Malvan, Netrani, in Lakshadweep you do see, in Gulf of Mannar, Andaman, Nicobar, in all of these areas, you do see coral reefs. Then coming into the global level, in the global level, you see coral reefs as I told you in the Great Barrier Reef. Then you do see in an area called as your coral triangle. The coral triangle is primarily comprising of major nations like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines. It's almost what you say, it has 6 major countries. The 3 bigger countries over there are Malaysia, Philippines and Indonesia. The smaller ones are Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, and each of these parts cover almost 6 million square kilometer, and this is called as your coral triangle, where you find the second most largest collection of your coral reefs. So that also is understood. Now coming on to some other kinds of corals that we have to know. See, as I told you, it's not just your coral reefs that which has zooxanthellae that exist in the world. If you have zooxanthellae, all those conditions I told you are important. It has to have warm water, it cannot be shallow, it has to be shallow, it cannot be deeper. All of these conditions are important. But even in other parts of the world, there are corals. Okay? And when I'm saying other parts of the world, that means that it can grow in deep waters, it can grow in cold waters, it can grow in areas which have fresh water. So you have different types of corals. So always understand, there's a lot of misconception that happens between students that says that, okay, corals can. See, the large majority of corals in the world are seen in the tropical areas. The Great Barrier Reef, the Malaysian ones that we just spoke about, all of these are the tropical ones, and that is where the largest majority of corals are. But you do have other varieties also. This is one such variety, black corals. From the very word itself, it's clear, it's black in color, it does not have zooxanthellae present in it. So if it doesn't have zooxanthellae present in it, then the conditions it grows would be what? It can be in shallow waters and it can be in deep waters. They do not have any symbiotic algae associated with them. So next comes the question, if they do not have symbiotic algae associated with them, how do they eat? And this is where you have to understand the second mechanism that corals use to, or not second mechanism, another popular mechanism that corals use to feed themselves. And this is called as filter feeding. This is a previous UPSC question also, but it was not asked with respect to corals. What exactly is filter feeding? Filter feeding is the process by which you are not, because this coral is, here also it's stationary, it's not moving around or anything, it's stationary. It cannot be like, okay, I want prawns for today's lunch, I'm going to eat that. That is not possible. So what happens is, this coral will have to continuously let water flow through it. Okay, so when water flows through it, if something gets trapped, some organism gets trapped in that water flow, and the water gets filtered out, and whatever is that organism that gets into it is consumed by the coral. Okay, so what happens over here? Filter feeding is a method by which you don't specifically prey on a single creature, but then you take the surrounding liquid or water, whatever it is, and then you filter out the whatever prey that you need from it. Okay, and this is not just a coral feature. I also want you to understand, it's not a feature that is seen just in stationary organisms also. A very common, pelicans. If you've seen pelicans, the pelican bird, it has this huge beak-like thing which is there. You will see that what the pelican does is also filter feeding. You will see that in that large beak of the pelican, there's a small hole like sort of a thing. What happens is, it will take the water all together, and from that whole part of it, the water gets filtered out. Whatever fish or whatever remains within it is consumed by the pelican. So there are a lot of other creatures which are filter feeders. Black corals are just one example of it. Another aquatic ecosystem that we have to discuss are your kelp forests. Kelp forests again have been in news this year. Every year there is some or the other things in news. So I would say this kelp forest, seaweed. I had come across an article. We'll discuss seaweed and everything in current affairs, but just keep a note if you already have notes in it. Consider that, it's a little bit more important. Seaweed. seaweeds are also important for this year's prelims, because I've at least seen 2 to 3 major articles regarding seaweed cultivation. Down to Earth has done a feature on it. So seaweed is important. Coming back to kelp forests are actually those kind of extremely large algae, extremely large brown algae that exist in this manner. It's formed in shallow water by the dense growth of different species. So you will see that it's seen in shallow water, it's seen in cold and nutrient rich water. Okay, so understand it is not occurring somewhere in your tropics. It's a little bit towards your higher areas, in your temperate zones where you see kelp forest mostly. They live further away from the tropics, and you have a species of kelp that keeps coming in the news. It's called as your laminarealis. So laminarealis, you can just keep a note of it. If you just hear the word, it's related to your kelp forest. This is another kind of aquatic ecosystem. Then we move on to the aquatic ecosystem that is of much more importance to us, which is the mangroves. Okay, again, we have several schemes. I think West Bengal government has come up with a same scheme. Then you already have the Mishti, you have PM Pranam, you have so many schemes associated with mangroves coming up. No, it's already there in the news. No, the scheme part we will discuss, but first, and then there's a lot of international organizations. So mangroves, again, always a hot topic, will ever be a hot topic for UPSC. Coming to mangroves, the understanding of it. See, mangroves are primarily flowering trees that belong to different families like Rhizophore, Acanthaceae, Lythraceae, Competraceae, Ericaceae, etc. Why am I telling you these words? Please don't mug it up or anything. Just have just hear it once, okay? So Rhizophore, Acanthaceae, all of these terms, when you hear, understand, these are primarily belonging to the family of mangroves. Now, what exactly is so important about mangroves? Mangroves are halophytic in nature. That means they are salt loving in nature. This is an important thing about mangroves, and you will see the conditions of mangrove growth happen to be perfect in areas of your tropical and subtropical latitudes. So you will see that from your, if I had to place it from 0 to 30, again, put it like this, 30° north, 30° south. You do see a lot of mangrove coming up in the coastlines. We will discuss why coastlines become important. Why? Because as I told you, these are halophytic in nature. So they can occur in those areas even where there is salt water. You need soil, but you need salt water also, and they can occur over there. Now coming about some features of your mangroves. Mangroves are primarily those kind of organisms that can grow. Mangroves are those kind of organisms that can grow in saline environment. I just told you that. Mangroves can grow in low oxygen. Why are they growing in low oxygen? Because the point is, when you have these areas where you have water intermixed with soil, what happens is it has very, very less, or the ability to contain oxygen over there is very less. Which means what? You need those kind of plants which have the feature to grow in such deficient oxygen conditions. Okay, so they should be able to grow in salt, they should be able to grow in low oxygen, and to compensate for these low oxygen conditions, the mangroves have a feature called as your breathing roots. Breathing roots. So here you will see that when you have a mangrove plant, you will have certain upward creations like this, and these are roots trying to, it's trying to like come up onto the surface, and on the surface of the roots you have small pores, and these are called as your pneumatophores, and this will help in taking in the oxygen for the respiration purposes. Got it? So here you have low oxygen, and mangroves are viviparous in nature. Viviparous primarily means it's a feature wherein the organisms, the younger generation, for example, you have two words, there is oviparous and viviparous. Oviparous is those kind of organisms where the parent gives birth to a very premature form of the fetus. Like for example, it will lay an egg. You know that even after laying an egg, the rest of the development of that fetus happens in the outside world. It's given heat, it's given so much of care, and then is where the complete development of it happens, and then it hatches and comes out. Which means in oviparous creatures, what happens? The development of the fetus means the kid, smaller, the baby of it happens partly in the mother's body and partly in the external atmosphere. Okay, as opposed to viviparous creatures like humans, where what happens is after complete period of gestation of 8 to 9 months, what happens is the fully formed baby is what comes out. Okay, it'll have all its features and then it grows. Got it? So I am now saying mangroves are viviparous. Viviparous means what? Here on the tree itself, what happens is rather than just giving out the seed, on the tree itself, the seed will slowly germinate. It will have a stem, it will have a root and everything. See, it will become a small seedling, and that seedling is what is given out from the plant. Why are we doing it like that? If the seedling is given out from the plant, it becomes easier for it to go and place itself in the soil. So you can see that this is both an adaptive feature and much more efficient way to preserve its younger generation. So it's viviparous in nature. Then another feature is mangroves are having a waxy coating on its leaves. Okay, then it also has the unique capability of growing within the reach of tides in soil. So even if there is so much of force coming off, your mangroves will not get uprooted off. Added to this, the salt-loving feature of mangroves also equips it to live in conditions where whatever in these, you have this water and everything that the root takes in, it has the ability to absorb toxic metals, thereby purifying the soil near it. Okay, so this is also something that mangroves does. In India, if you look at it, if you are looking at the mangrove states of India, mangroves in total cover 0.15% of the total geographical area of India. And you will see that you have areas like your West Bengal, Gujarat, etc., which are very high when it comes to the mangrove coverage of the state. And you will see that a lot of your southern states, you will see that where you have deltas of the Ganga, Mahanadi, Krishna, Godavari and Kaveri, you have a lot of mangrove formations also. That doesn't mean that, again, have a look over here, you have mangrove formations in the western part and in the eastern part. Okay, so you do see that here in the western part it's comparatively lesser, but in the eastern part you have more. Why? Because you have the deltas of Ganga, Mahanadi, Krishna, Godavari, Kaveri, all of these deltas are formed over here. So this is the reason why you have more formations in the eastern side, but the western side also has mangrove population. There are certain current affairs associated with mangroves as to the different international organizations, etc. That gets covered in the current affairs part of the session. So right now, this is just the static part of mangroves. And I want you to be introduced to a specific species from an environment context, and this is called as Avicennia marina. Avicennia marina is a species. We will again, I believe when we are doing current affairs, we'll talk about it once again. But now, for those who are hearing this session, understand these are highly efficient mangrove species. Even amongst the mangroves, they are like a star. Why? Because it grows in areas where it can tolerate up to 250% plus salinity. It grows optimally in 75% seawater. It has salt secreting and extraordinarily salt tolerant features which is there. It's a it can whatever thing, first of all, it can grow in this much of salt water. It is among a rare plant species which can excrete 40% of the salt through the salt glands which are there in its leaves, besides its extraordinary capacity to exclude salt entry to the roots. So Avicennia marina is a wonder mangrove plant where it can grow in salt water. It can grow in salt water primarily because it can exclude the salt water entry through the roots, and whatever enters through all the other areas, it can excrete almost 40% of the salt through the salt glands. This is the reason why it is adapted to live in such conditions. So just keep this plant and its features in mind. Now we move into another area. I wouldn't call it specifically as an aquatic ecosystem, but you have to understand that a lot of times I've seen students get very unclear ideas about these two terms. First of all, I just discussed mangroves to you, and I clearly told you mangroves are a kind of flowering plants. Okay, and where you have so many of those mangroves, where you have so many of those features, you call it as a mangrove area. Grove means what? It's a collection of trees. Okay, so when you have those kind of flowering plants, you call it as a mangrove area which is there. But that is not equivalent to this concept of wetlands. Okay, so wetlands is a much more larger concept. Mangroves are just a type of wetlands, or mangroves you can say are the kind of vegetation you do see in a type of wetlands. So understand, all the areas where you might see mangroves can be categorized as wetlands, but that doesn't mean that all the wetlands will have mangrove species. Not necessary, because wetlands, the idea of wetlands is much more larger than that. Wetlands are areas that can be marshy or peatland. It can have water that is static or flowing, fresh water or brackish or saline, or it can even include marine water in areas where you have the beach, where water comes about into a certain length of almost 6 meters into the shore. In those areas, you can call it as your wetlands. So my point being, you cannot say that wetlands are, the idea of wetlands are so broad. So don't equate wetlands is always mangroves. Wetlands are much more larger. Your lake areas, the areas from the lake to the, where the lake and the land overslide, that is a wetland. Your areas from the ocean where the water comes about into the coast, that area can be a wetland. You can have so many or larger ideas of wetlands. Now, this is where it becomes important. There is a convention called as Ramsar Convention, and the Ramsar Convention tries to protect wetlands of the world. Okay. The Ramsar Convention came about in 1971. As of today, the Ramsar has 171 members, and the Ramsar tries to understand about the wise use of wetland. This is important because this is a previous UPSC question. I want you to understand that wise use of wetlands means you are not going to ban the usage of wetlands or anything. You use the wetlands, but in a very sustainable manner is what Ramsar tries to tell you. And now few factual details about this. All over the world, there are almost 2,400 Ramsar sites. The first site was declared in the Cobourg Peninsula, which is in Australia. Okay, even today when you look at it, when you look at the number of sites of wetlands, United Kingdom, UK has the largest sites. The number, when you look at it, the highest number of wetlands are there in UK. There's 175 of them. Then you have Mexico, which has almost 142. If you look at the area covered under wetlands, Bolivia has the highest area covered under wetlands. Okay, so none of these facts feature India. Now coming into India and Ramsar, we are continuously increasing the number of Ramsar sites. I believe right now we have almost 76 sites which are there. This is something that keeps on increasing. So you are not expected to know the correct number at what point, or if there's a statement. So they will not ask you such a statement. But understand the fact that when you look at the total number of Ramsar sites, Tamil Nadu is way ahead in the number of Ramsar sites, followed by UP, Odisha, Punjab, etc. But when it comes to the area covered under Ramsar sites, West Bengal has the highest area, followed by Odisha, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, etc. The largest wetlands in India happen to be the Sundarbans. The smallest happen to be the Renuka Lake. And the oldest ones means the first ones that were declared under Ramsar sites were in Chilika and Koldeo. See, now this is where it gets this much fact you have to know. Now what we have to know are the different Ramsar sites that have come in news that are important from that aspect, and that will be discussed in the current affairs part. Why? Because see, until now, if whatever facts that you get, maybe a statement might come from it, but I do feel that any statement that can be asked will be from the current affair point of view also. There might be 2 or 3 statements from there. So now from the current affair part, what important Ramsar sites are there, that will be discussed in the current affair environment session which is there. Okay, so I hope till here the facts are clear to you. Now we move into a concept. So we have discussed the different ecosystems that are important from the environment point of view. We've discussed the forest when it comes to the terrestrial ones. We've discussed the aquatic ecosystems, the features of it. Now we are moving into the next part. So we were right now in level 4. Now you are leveling up to level 5 of your environment difficulty, and this is something to do with a concept called as biodiversity. Understand that all around the world there is so much of variety of plants and animals, and this variety of plants and animals is called by the term biodiversity. Before we go into the depth of biodiversity, I hope if things are clear till here, I want you to raise a thumbs up or put into the comments that things till level 4 are clear, those who are regularly watching these videos, so that at least I can be, even if I'm not interacting with you directly, I know that things are getting clear for you. It's a small thing. You can just put it in the comments so that you also have a sense of achievement that okay, yeah, I have completed or I have reached till that difficulty level. So level 4 is completed. So just let me know in the comments. Now let's move on to level 5. And this variety, whenever I'm saying okay, you have a variety of clothes or variety of makeup or variety of something, a variety, you like eating variety of food, you can measure variety by 2 different features. Okay, something is called as, the 2 different features are called as species richness and species evenness. So what is this concept of richness and evenness? This is what we're going to discuss next. Okay, species richness is something that is just related to one set of ecosystem, one specific ecosystem. Means what? Let's look at, there are two diagrams over here, and look at community, just community A. Okay, in community A, you will see that you have, 4 different one kind of birds. You have 3, again, you have here the different varieties that are there are how many? This is one. This is another kind of bird. This is another kind of bird. Okay. So, in that one community itself, in that one specific ecosystem over here, you are having 3 different types of birds. Got it? This is the measure of the number of species found in a community. That measure is called as species richness. How much number, or how much in one specific community itself, how much number of species are there. Here also, when you are looking at it, how many varieties are over there? You will see that there is one kind, there's a second kind, there's a third kind. Even so, the species richness over here is also 1, 2 and 3. Okay. The numbers might vary within each species, but if you look individually in each community, we are just taking community A to understand species richness. So I want you to keep in mind, species richness is not comparing yourself with others. It's just you particularly, in your case, how many varieties are there. So if I'm asking you what is your variety when it comes to your clothes? So you will just look like, okay, I have this, one type. You might have maybe like 30 different shirts. But then you will be like, shirt is one kind of cloth I have. Then dress is another kind of cloth I have. Then you have another kind which is maybe your, shawls or dupattas. So then that is another kind of cloth that you have. So what all varieties you have. Okay, in that variety, you can have how many ever. You can have how many ever shirts, how many ever dupattas, etc. But then, if I am asking you how many variety of clothes that you have, you will be probably looking and telling me, so I have dupatta, I have shirt, I have skirt, I have all of these different kinds. Okay. Now comes another concept called as species evenness. And to understand species evenness, you need to compare between 2 different areas. So this is where you need community A and community B, and you're going to compare between 2. Species evenness is a measure of the relative abundance of the different species making up the richness of an area, which means relative abundance of the area means what? If I'm looking at community A, here there are 3 varieties. Here there are 3 varieties. Okay. Now, in the 3 varieties, if I'm naming this one as A, this one as B, and this one as C. Okay. Now, A species over here is what? 1, 2, 3, 4. A species, the one that is on the slide like this, here there is only 1. B species over here, the ones that are horizontal, that is 1, 2, 3, 4. B species over here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 of them. C species over here are 4 of it. C species over here is again 1. If I'm looking at the end, here the varieties 3, totally there is 12 species, 12 individuals. But here you will see that between A, B and C, you have 4, 4, 4. Here between A, B and C species, you will see that there is 10, which is much more abundant than the other 2 species which is there. If I am comparing both of these communities, in which community is species more evenly distributed? species is more equally distributed. Not evenly does not even mean equally. It just means at least comparatively, equally. Where is it distributed? In community A. So community A has much more species evenness than community B. So this is also a variety, this is also a criteria by which I can measure my biodiversity, because earlier, as I told you, okay, you can just say that I have varieties of clothes, but then when you are comparing two species, then you also, when you're comparing two sets of biodiversity, so the clothes that you have and the clothes that your sister has, now what has happened, you have to see amongst each of these who has much more even distribution. Okay, so this is what becomes as the next feature. I hope you've noticed in both of these things, nowhere have they said the number of species is very important. It's the variety that is more important in both of these conditions, and based on this is where you have species richness and species evenness as two criteria to measure biodiversity. Now we have to go a little bit deeper into these facts. Now we are moving into some of the facts associated with biodiversity that might come handy when you are solving questions. When it comes to the biodiversity around the globe, let's have a look at what is the primary biodiverse areas. You will see that when you are looking at the different vertebrates, invertebrates and plants, let's have a look at which is majority. So you will see that amongst each of this, what is the variety, we will start looking, but globally if you have to look at it, more than 70% of all the species recorded are animals, while plants, that is algae, fungi, bryophytes, gymnosperms and angiosperms, comprise no more than 22% of the total. Which means in this diagram, your invertebrates and your vertebrates together, they contribute almost 70%, and your plants contribute 22% of the biodiversity of the world. So this is the first stat that you need to know. So which is amongst the plants and animals which are more widely situated, you have your animals more than your plants. Okay. Then in this itself, let's start looking at the animal varieties over here. If you're looking at invertebrates, invertebrates means, see, when it comes to the spinal column which is there, invertebrates are the ones that have a much more, or it does not have a proper spinal column. Vertebrates are the ones which have a proper spinal column. So invertebrate species, when you look at it, the insects are a large number over here. Then all the others are much smaller. Vertebrates, when you look at it, it's fishes which are much more larger in number. The others are more or less like you have birds and reptiles which are somewhat equal, then amphibians and mammals which are also somewhat equally placed. Okay, so I would say when it comes to invertebrates, your insects are much more larger or higher in number. When it comes to vertebrates, your fishes are much more higher in number. Now to look at some other facts associated with it. See, if I am just taking, I can compare biodiversity in different aspects. One aspect, as I just told you, is amongst your vertebrates, amongst your invertebrates, how you can compare them. I can also compare between your land and water. Okay, between land and water, when I am comparing, let's have a look at it. You have terrestrial ecosystems and you have aquatic ecosystems. Now, our comparison over here is, when you have terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, you have to see over here, 90% of all the species on the terrestrial biome are that of arthropoda. belongs to the category of insects. You have a lot of higher family. It belongs to the phylum called as Arthropoda. Yesterday we had talked about phylum Chordata. I'd shown you when it came to fox. So similarly, there's a phylum called as Arthropoda, and 90% of all the terrestrial biome features, or the one species which are there, they belong to the phylum which is Arthropoda. So when I'm looking at the phylums, understand terrestrial 90% is Arthropoda and only 10% is all the other different phylums that could be there. But in comparison to that, in the aquatic ecosystem, you will see that the phylums which are over there in the aquatic ecosystem, it has much varieties over there. Much varieties. It's not like 90% belongs to one. They have so many different varieties over there. So if I had to compare the phylum diversity between terrestrial and aquatic, think about it. Which has much more phylum diversity? The aquatic ecosystem has much more phylum diversity, because they have different varieties, different varieties of different phylums over there. But on land, 90% belongs to one phylum itself, which means what is so much variety over there. So if I'm looking at the phylum diversity, your terrestrial biomes are very weak and your aquatic biomes or aquatic ecosystems are having much more phylum diversity. Now comes the important point over there. But if I had to compare the number of species, if I am comparing the diversity of species which is there, you will see that here in marine species, you have some 2 lakh marine species, in comparison to almost 12 million terrestrial species, which means you will see that in the aquatic ecosystem, they might have much more phylum diversity, but you have much less number of species in your aquatic ecosystem. So again, to bring forth the point, on terrestrial ecosystems, 90% might be in Arthropoda phylum. So they don't have much phylum diversity, but the variety within it is so high. So much so that if you ask me which is more diverse in the number of species, which is more diverse is your terrestrial ecosystem. Okay, if you are looking at the phylum diversity, phylum I'm stressing it's the group that is there. The phylum diversity which is there, it's your aquatic ecosystem. Okay, even in terrestrial where you have extremely high species diversity, you find it in your tropical region. Okay, then coming to few other facts when it comes to plants, can you look over here and see that in the case of plants, when you look at the diversities that are there, fungi species have very high diversity. Then you have angiosperms which are there. Then all the others form little bit part of the rest of it. So again, remember these things. This diagram, it's directly taken from an NCERT, and you know how much they are, have a love relationship with NCERT. So just keep a look at this if they can ask you a fact or a factual question related to this. Okay, then I want to introduce you to a term called as bioprospecting. Bioprospecting primarily means that you're going and searching for the different, in an area, if you are saying there is so much of biological diversity, what you do is you are trying to extract the biological diversity for commercial purposes. Okay, this is the important keyword over here. It's not just extracting biodiversity for research, it's biodiversity for commercial purposes. Okay, in this manner, for example, the opium poppy that has given us morphine. It's a pain reliever, it's a drug, but that is now being sold commercially. You have the white willow tree, which has helped us develop aspirin, and that is also sold commercially. So all of these features where you're searching for compounds that can be sold commercially, the process that you're searching for is called as bioprospecting, and the end products, you get some commercial product that you can sell on a larger scale. Just introducing the word in case you do not know. Now we come into a crucial part. So we have established the fact that biodiversity exists. Now we have to understand biodiversity has to be preserved, it has to be conserved, and primarily biodiversity conservation is of two categories. You have something called as in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. Situ primarily means site. So in situ means at the site itself you're preserving. Ex situ means away from the site. Okay, so in situ means if you want to preserve something, you create setups over there in that area, and you are not displacing the animal or the species from there, you're preserving it there. Ex situ means due to some conditions, you're not able to keep the animal in those conditions over there. Maybe it's harmful for the animal also, animal or plant. So you take it from there and you preserve it at a much more safer place. For example, some examples of ex situ conservation are your zoos, seed banks, wildlife safari parks. This is important because a lot of times people think that the safari is happening through the actual forest, which is not. What happens is some species are taken from the forest area. Forest-like conditions are created for those species, and it is used, to create awareness and everything. People can take wildlife safari through it, but this is actually an ex situ mode of conservation. So, which means that the animal is taken from its original site. Then you have botanical gardens. All of these things are your ex situ modes of conservation. Moving forward to your in situ modes of conservation, you have in situ modes in the form of on-site conservation of genetic resources in natural populations. So when I'm saying genetic resources, it can be the entire animal, it can be the genetic resources just extracted from the animal. So your biosphere reserves, national parks, sanctuaries, reserved forests, protected forest, and nature reserves, all of this belong to your in situ conservation. One thing that I want to tell you over here is there is a concept called as gene sanctuaries. Just like wildlife sanctuaries, etc., gene sanctuaries are there where the genetic content is preserved within the site of extraction itself. Okay, so that is also an in situ mode. So see, now if they want to create a variety question on it, they'll have to pick up something like, it's quite unheard of. That is why I have given you this. So in situ mode, gene sanctuaries are also an in situ mode of conservation. With this part, we have successfully completed all the static parts that you need to know. And so you've crossed from level 1, you've crossed till level 5, and you're done over there. From here onwards, what is happening is we have certain Indian legislations that you need to know from an environment point of view. Indian concepts, not only Indian concepts, international concepts also. This is what we are going into right now. Okay, so if you've understood till here, good job. You've done excellently well, and if you've answered all the questions I've asked along with it, you've done very well. Now we move into, and there won't be any more levels because this in itself is a huge level that is there. And here I expect you to pay a much more clear attention, because I don't take this part as a normal, following a normal textbook route or anything. This is done after I found this area difficult to learn. So I've created a pattern for it. So I hope you pay attention. And now we are moving into biodiversity conservation purely from an Indian standpoint, but we have to discuss some international things also in it. Okay, dear students, now what we have to discuss is about the biodiversity conservation in India. Okay, to understand biodiversity conservation, you have to understand how it works in the world entirely. Okay, see, each country, now for in India's concept, India has a much more clearer idea about how to preserve its biodiversity in a good manner. Okay, because we are more familiar with what our land is like, what are our specific problems, etc. Okay, so obviously you need to preserve it at your national level. You need to have certain laws, certain regulations, etc. for it. Also, globally in the world, you have certain international bodies, international laws, international conventions that say that, since we all are part, because it's not that, okay, biodiversity in India has to be preserved. If biodiversity in India has to be preserved, it's not like only we will suffer. There are certain climatic factors and everything that India will be contributing to. As they say, it will have a butterfly effect on some other part in the world. So it's not just that, okay, fine, we can leave biodiversity conservation to each country. The world also has a responsibility. So there are certain international bodies and international conventions also. But not the problem exactly, but to understand this, get the idea that when you have international conservation, international legislation, international bodies, etc., we will be very happy. Now in the Indian context, we go and we are like, yeah, we'll do this. But we will come to a country and we are ready to do it also. But understand the fact that it will get legal sanctity in our country. Legal sanctity means, like, if someone is not doing it, if you want to raise a court case, or if you want to file a case against any of these things, it will be part of the legal system only if it is part of the Indian law. Okay, so we can go and sign as many treaties we want in the international world. We can come to our country. We can let them do, for example, whatever, conventions or anything that is over here. But if I want to raise a complaint or anything against the way it is being done, I can only do it if India came back and India said, okay, we have signed this treaty over there. Now I am going to make a law that will give legal sanctity to this concept. If that is not done, it's good as like, yeah, it's a casual thing, let them do it. Okay. So the reason I am specifying this is, when I am teaching this area of biodiversity conservation, there are certain concepts in India that we have seen. Like, for example, there is a concept called as biosphere reserves. How many of you until now thought biosphere reserves are part of the Indian law? No, it's not part of the Indian law. It's not part of the Indian law. But we have biosphere reserves in our country. We are having so many areas that are there as biosphere reserves. Got it? So, my point being over here, you will see that the biodiversity conservation in India happens through two categories. One is through international legislation and bodies, and the other one is through Indian legislations. The first category that we are going to study is through international legislations or international bodies. And the first such thing that we are discussing is a concept called as biodiversity hotspot. This idea was given internationally by a body. It was initially given by a person called as Norman Myers. And Norman Myers' idea was taken up by this organization called as Conservation International. And these guys, Conservation International, is what said that, okay, let's have this concept called as biodiversity hotspots. Let's go and find the regions which are having high species richness and high degree of endemism. What does endemism means? Endemism means those species will occur only and only in that specific area. That means you are so that species is so unique that it is not going to occur in that very specific area. It's not occurring anywhere else in the world. Okay, so here in Biodiversity Hotspot, Conservation International said, let's go look around the world, figure out the areas which are having high species richness, high degree of endemism. They gave certain criteria for it. They said that the area must contain at least 1,500 species of vascular plants. Vascular means the ones that have a clear body, not algae and everything. So that has a clear body. 1,500 species of vascular plants as endemic species. That means that many plants should be only and only in that specific area. So this is the first thing. Second criteria is that area should have lost at least 70% of its original habitat. Okay, so it's an area that's very high in species richness and endemism, but it's also getting destructed. This is the reason why we're going and choosing and finding out the place. Okay, and in this manner, they went about and they chose some areas in the world as biodiversity hotspots, and obviously some Indian areas also are part of it. You have the Himalayas, the Indo-Burma area, the Western Ghats in Sri Lanka, Sunda lands, all of these parts are under your they've designated as biodiversity hotspots. Now my question is, does Indian law have to do anything to protect it? No. We don't have any law to do biodiversity hotspot protection. We cooperate with Conservation International whenever they want to protect it. Okay, so this is your biodiversity hotspot. The second international body that gave up a conservation idea was your UNESCO. In 1971, they came up with a program called as Man and Biosphere Program. Okay, Man and Biosphere Program, which came in 1971, was implemented in India in 1986. And it is part of this program that we created something. When I'm saying we created, understand, UNESCO asked us to create, and we created something called as Biosphere Reserves. Now my first question, are biosphere reserves protected under the Indian law? Or is it mentioned in any Indian law? No, it's not. I'll tell you what is mentioned. In some amount of time, I'll tell you what's mentioned. But understand, the term biosphere reserves do not feature in Indian laws. We don't have any law that says, okay, biosphere reserves conservation program or conservation law. Nothing. We don't have any of these things. We do have certain biospheres which are there, biosphere reserves which are there. If you look at it, if you look at the map, you have Gulf of Mannar, Agastya Malay, Nilgiri, Sheshachalam. You have so many biosphere reserves in India, but you don't have legal sanctity in it. Now, this is where I want you to be introduced to a concept. Wherever there is a biosphere reserve, UNESCO gave an idea that, see, because in lot of areas, wherever there is so much of biodiversity, you have people also living along with it. You cannot kick out the people in an east. Like, you cannot be like, okay, fine, this is biodiversity, so you all get out. That cannot be the case. So, UNESCO gave about an idea which was zoning of biosphere reserves. Zoning means you choose a biosphere reserve, and that biosphere reserve will be divided in it itself into different areas. You can have something called as a core area. You can have around the core area, you can have a buffer area, and then you can have a transition area. Okay. So, what is the relevance of it? Core area will be determined as that part where you need to have extremely high levels of protection. There you cannot have any human activity, and humans also should understand this, because that area will have very important species that needs to be preserved. Okay, so core area will just be for monitoring purposes. You cannot even have research, or you cannot have tourism. You cannot have any of those activities in your core area. In your buffer area, you can have education activities, you can have research activities, you can have even a slightly smaller settlements, etc. But not so many of it. And that too, it is all up to whoever is there, like which area that you cannot enter the core area, but you can enter, you can be in the buffer area. Transition area allows tourism, recreation, all of these activities are allowed in your transition area. Now, the relevance of it is understandable that any tourism or recreation activities that happen in your transition area, their impact will be felt by the buffer zone and not by the core area, which means what? The animals and plants and everything in the core area will be preserved in a good manner. Okay, so everyone's happy because of it. Now, this is where you have to understand, once we've put it in this manner, I just told you core area, buffer area, everything is there. Who will enforce it? It's not, I just told you it's not under the Indian law. So then how can, if someone is going and creating one resort in the core area, how will you punish him? And this is where we will study the rest part of it when it comes to the Indian legislation. So keep this in mind. Biosphere reserves might not be mentioned in the Indian law, but we wanted to protect this. It's not like, okay, it's international, we won't do it. We wanted to protect this. So we created our own mechanism to protect it. Okay, we'll come to that very soon. Just keep this in mind. Biosphere reserve is divided into core, buffer and transition. This zoning is not protected under Indian law, but then we created something on our own to protect all of these areas. Anyway, just have a look at the biosphere reserves in the country. If you're keen enough, you can just quickly, take up any, if you have an environment text or anything, if you have that appendix pages, they would have given a map of this. You can have a quick look. No need to create a map or anything. If you've not already created a map, then this is high time that you don't indulge in that right now. Those who have created maps for biosphere reserves, have a quick look at what all areas, especially I'll tell you, have a look at what are the areas that are there in Agasthyamale, Nilgiri. In these areas, it is not just, this biosphere reserve is composed of several national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. Okay. This is important for us to understand. You will start noticing that every biosphere reserve, as we go further and study, every biosphere reserve that is listed in this chart, this map, turns out to either to be a wildlife sanctuary or a national park, or a combination of both national park and wildlife sanctuary. So somehow it is all turning out to be a national park or wildlife sanctuary. And why have we done that? This is what we have done from our end. Okay, so we might not be having biosphere reserves mentioned in our Indian laws, but in a certain Indian law that we'll study in detail, we have concepts of national park and wildlife sanctuary. And once we declare that as a national park or wildlife sanctuary, it comes under an Indian law. And if it comes under an Indian law, I can protect it in a much more better manner. Got it? So this is the reason why a lot of you, when you study biosphere reserves, you will see that Agasthyamale Biosphere Reserve has Neyyar, all of these different wildlife sanctuaries and tiger reserves and national parks. And so, why? Because that is what gave it a Indian legal sanctity. We'll get into more of it as we go. Now coming into, so we were in the second kind of international thing. So we first studied Conservation International's biodiversity hotspots. The second thing we did was your Man and Biosphere program by UNESCO. UNESCO also went about and declared, this is the third thing that was done Internationally, there is something called as World Heritage Sites. You are familiar with this. There are certain natural heritage sites and there are certain cultural heritage sites. The natural heritage sites are the ones that are listed over here. You can have a look. The first one that was listed was Manas Wildlife Sanctuary. The names are important if they ever ask you. So Manas, Keldio, Kaziranga, Sundarbans, Nanda Devi Valley of Flowers, Western Ghats and Great Himalayan are your purely natural World Heritage Site. And then there is another one called as your Kanchenjunga. Kanchenjunga is listed as a mixed site. Mixed site means it is both natural and culturally significant. Okay, the cultural heritage sites or the important ancient, those kind of sites you would have studied in culture, Khajuraho and your different Hampi temples, lot of such structures are there. Those are your cultural heritage sites. Now, Kanchenjunga is a mixed site, which means it's both natural and cultural in form. The fourth international thing that we've discussed are something called as your marine protected areas. Marine protected areas came about as an international thing, but later on what have been done is we've started notifying it under a certain act of India, which is Wildlife Protection Act. So I want you to remember when it initially came about, it was just marine protected areas. Just have a look at it. These different Marine protected areas, Gulf of Mannar, Point Calimere. There is a Marine National Park which is dark yellow in color, white color is Wildlife Sanctuary. So what happened is, initially, globally, they came up with the concept Marine Protected Areas, MPAs. Okay, so we also have sea areas that we had to protect. So what did we do is, when we created Wildlife Protection Act, we said just like we're going to create national parks and everything inside the country, even for these sea areas, let's create national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. So MPA, Marine Protected Areas, this term you will not find anywhere in the law. What you will find is Marine National Park, Marine Wildlife Sanctuary, etc. Okay, and so the Wildlife Protection Act of India gives protection to these national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, and almost 31 such protected areas in India. Okay, so this is it came about as international, but we later on took it and made it, or have incorporated some amount of it into Indian law, but it came about as an international thing. Now, the final one over here, key biodiversity areas. Key biodiversity areas is something that came about by IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. Conservation of Nature. Okay, they went about and they created, it's just those protected areas or those areas that need to be protected internationally from, look at all the criteria. It can be terrestrial, freshwater, marine. It can be plant, animal species. It can be extensive biodiversity, and they define 11 broad criteria, which means you can have so many sites listed under it, and there are almost 531 sites listed under the idea of key biodiversity areas. So to sum it up, we were discussing international conservation, and international conservation, we talked about biodiversity hotspots, biosphere reserves, world heritage sites, marine protected areas, and key biodiversity areas. These are all international in nature. Please remember, these are all international in nature. These are not defined in any, or these terms you will not find in Indian laws. You will not find legal sanctity for any of these under Indian laws. Now let's move into the Indian laws. So now I want you to understand, when we go into Indian legislation, initially when our constitution came about, you all know from the polity part of it, initially when the constitution came about, we did not have any provision in it directly related to the protection of environment. Okay, there was no provision in it. Later on, in your 42nd amendment is where we started having provisions for environment, and this is where we introduced a fundamental duty of 51 AG, DPSP of 48A, Article 21, or Article 21, again understand Article 21 was there previously, it was protection to life and liberty, but it is only much later that we started saying that, okay, yeah, right to a clean and healthy environment will be coming under your Article 21. So this was only much later that it happened. Anyway, one of the first laws that came about and that we have to study in detail is our very large and very prominent Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. This act has been controversial. This act has a lot of provisions that can serve as different questions. So understand, the Wildlife Protection Act came about in the year 1972. Anytime an act in India comes about, it creates certain bodies for its, functioning, its proper functioning. The Wildlife Protection Act gave rise to certain concepts like this, and the Wildlife Protection Act declared these things: wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, conservation reserves, community reserves, tiger reserves. They created these bodies for the protection of biodiversity, for the protection of particularly what? For the protection of wildlife. Understand, wildlife doesn't just mean animals, wild plants, anything in the wild is encompassed under this. Wildlife sanctuaries, I would suggest now, from now onwards, what do? You just create a column sort of a thing and move quickly. So 1972 Act created these sanctuaries. Look at it again. There is no elephant reserves mentioned over here. There's just tiger reserves mentioned. Sanctuaries, wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, nothing else is mentioned over there. These words are important. Okay, then along with it, it also created, I want you to understand, as you have learned in polity, so 1972 the act came about, but the act got amended several times, in 2002, in 2006, in 1983, in all of these times the act got amended. Sometimes when an amendment comes about, a new body was created as part of the amendment. We'll study what amendments created what, but understand broadly, your National Board for Wildlife, Central Zoo Authority, Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, and NTCA, that is your National Tiger Conservation Authority. All of these got created under your Wildlife Protection Act. Several amendments of it, but broadly under your Wildlife Protection Act. So if I'm saying Wildlife Protection Act 2006 amendment, understand, came in 2006, not from the original act. Original act is in 1972. Okay, I hope this is fine. Now, let's look at the things or the important aspects of your Wildlife Protection Act. The initial times, until very recently, we have a very recent amendment that has come about, but understand, until very recently, the Wildlife Protection Act divided all your animals into 6 animals, plants, everything into 6 schedules. And as part of it, the highest, and it was divided into 6 schedules based on the protection it was these animals needed. You would see that Schedule 1 and your Part 2 of Schedule 2. So Schedule 1. And in Schedule 2, there was a Part 2. All of these things, all of the animals that were listed under this category were given the highest level of protection. Okay. Thereafter, you had Schedule 3 and 4. You had, these animals were also protected, but the penalties were much more lower. I want you to understand, if in any schedule it has come, barring, or in the previous time when it came about, barring your Schedule 5, any other schedule, if it did come, you are granting protection to it. Protection is granted, it's just that what is the level of protection would be different for each. Understand? So here in Schedule 3 and 4 also they were protected, but it was that penalties were lower. You would see your cheetal, bharal, hyena, nilgai, sambar deer, all of these were included in your Schedule 3 and 4. Schedule 5 had a category called as vermin. Vermin means those animals that are harmful or that can turn harmful, wild animals that can turn harmful to human health, human economy, etc. and can be hunted, again, not just by you, but with specific permissions. Okay, and then finally you have Schedule 6, which was specific endemic plants that were there, that were prohibited from cultivation and planting. So for example, if there was a wild orchid over there, you cannot have that, as it is clearly prohibited from cultivation and agriculture, etc. So what was listed under Schedule 6 was also prohibited from cultivation, agriculture, etc. This was your previous act in the sense that until very recently this is what we had. And now we have a Wildlife Protection Amendment Bill, and now this is an act which is came about in 2022. So in the new act which mentioned, first of all, the primary difference is the act cut short the schedules. There are no 6 schedules anymore, there are just 4 schedules. And in the 4 schedules itself, they have changed what each schedule stands for. Now, for example, Schedule 1 still remains as a species that will enjoy the highest level of protection. Schedule 2 for species that will be subject to a lesser degree of protection, which means previously what was there in Schedule 3 and 4 all got subsumed under Schedule 2. What was there in Schedule 1 and 2 now all of it got subsumed into Schedule 1. Okay, so Schedule 1 has highest level of protection, Schedule 2 has lesser protection, Schedule 3 has plants, the wild plants, and Schedule 4 now is those species or those specimens which are listed under CITES. CITES is an international organization which tries to curb the export or the danger of, it tries to prevent the danger to species through your export, import, etc. So if there is any kind of such activities, if there is any kind of damage to a species because that species is getting illegally exported, or if it's getting illegally transported into any way, this is where CITES intervenes. Okay, now India is a very active member of CITES, and what has happened is, according to this, what we've done is, whatever species of India that CITES has listed as a very crucial or it is in danger thing, we have given a specific schedule to it in our Wildlife Protection Act. Okay, so this is also done. What significantly happened is, we have removed the schedule for vermin species. Okay, so this is what has happened in the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act. Now, what is of relevance to us is, as I told you, in the Wildlife Protection Act, it created certain bodies like national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, community reserves, conservation reserves, etc. Now, we have to go in detail into each of these parts. The first thing that we have to discuss is about national parks. In India, if you ask me, as per the Indian law, which is the most protected area under the law, it would be a national park. Why? Because in the national park can be declared by both the central government and the state government. Both of them can declare it. Once it is declared, no alteration of the boundaries of a national park shall be made except on a resolution passed by the state legislature. Okay, so it can be declared by the central government, it can be declared by the state government, whoever declares it. If you want to change the boundaries of it, it has to come from a resolution passed from the state legislature. Doesn't end there. You cannot have grazing of livestock. No grazing of any livestock shall also be permitted inside a national park. But if it's a wildlife sanctuary, which is a lesser protected area, you can have grazing in it. So this is the reason why I'm telling you, national park is one of the most protected areas when it comes to conservation in India. Okay, no grazing, no human activities. Even in the national park, it's clearly boundary based. So it's extremely high protected areas. Okay. Now, in India, if you look at it, Hemis National Park is the largest. If you look at the number of national parks, Madhya Pradesh has a quite good high number of national parks, followed by Andaman and Nicobar, and then Assam. If you look at the oldest national park, Corbett happens to be the oldest national park. Coming into the wildlife sanctuaries, again, wildlife sanctuaries are also declared under the 1972 Act. It's a much lesser severe protected areas. You can say, again, the state government or the central government can declare it. It's natural protected habitat created to conserve any specific wildlife or areas. Livestock, grazing, livestock rearing, grazing, all of these activities are allowed. So now I have taught you two things, this national park and this wildlife sanctuary. Wildlife sanctuaries are much more, it is an area where you can have even your human activities a little bit, and sometimes wildlife sanctuaries are created to protect specific species, etc. The next part that I want to discuss with you, which is conservation and community reserves. Why suddenly? So I talked about national park, talked about wildlife sanctuary. Now I'm talking about something called as conservation and community reserves, and now I'm going to discuss something. I'm going to read out the definition, and for a moment you just tell me if it sounds similar to something that you know. Conservation and community reserves are protected areas of India which typically act as a buffer zone or a connector zone or a migration corridor between established national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and reserved and protected forests of India. Does this seem like something that we know? Okay, here is where I am going to, and this should be very crystal clear in your head. I told you previously when we were discussing international legislations that we have a concept of biosphere reserves. And I also told you in biosphere reserves, you primarily had three zones: core area, buffer zone, and transition areas. Okay, this is what biosphere reserve we had discussed: core, buffer, transition. I also told you Indian law doesn't have any legal sanctity on it. But I also told you Indian law created its own methods, own systems to give sanctity to it. And what Indian law did was, equivalent to the core area of biosphere reserves, we categorize things as national park, wildlife sanctuaries, tiger reserves, etc. Okay, so if I am saying national park, wildlife sanctuaries, in India we give the same amount of protection as like a core area, that, or what, you know, when UNESCO said okay, core area should be protected, I told you core area will not have any human activities. National park does not have any human activities. Wildlife sanctuaries, lesser protection, but still it comes under, or in Indian part it comes like a core area. Then the buffer area which is there, the buffer area which was there internationally, when it comes to India, we have given it the sanctity of conservation and community reserves. This is our equivalent So when maybe Biosphere Reserve is not there under Indian law, but conservation and community reserves, which came about in the 2002 amendment of the Wildlife Protection Act, gives sanctity to the buffer area. Okay, so equivalent to the buffer area, we have conservation and community reserves, and equivalent to the transition areas, we have a concept called as reserved and protected forests. Reserved and protected forests. But this is where I want you to remember, this reserved and protected forest is not covered under the Wildlife Protection Act. It's covered under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. So, in India, we might not have a single term called as Biosphere Reserve, but we have taken that concept. We've divided areas into core, buffer and transition, but here we call core as National Park and Wildlife Sanctuary, protected under Wildlife Protection Act. We call buffer area as Community and Conservation Reserves, protected under Wildlife Protection Act, Amendment 2002. And the transition area we protect as reserved and protected forest, that covers under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. So using these two laws, we didn't give legal sanctity to Biosphere Reserve. What we did is we Indianized it. We have created our own system for it. Got it? So I wanted to remember this. Biosphere Reserve is not mentioned in an Indian law. Biosphere Reserve does not have legal sanctity. Why? Because in India, we have given legal sanctity to these concepts. Okay? So I hope now that bridge is clear to you. So if community and conservation reserve is clear, the next thing I want to discuss with you it's one of our favorite species that we have to talk a little bit about, the tiger conservation. Tiger conservation in India. Tiger, as you know, such an important species when it comes to, even for this year, because we've had certain census reports and everything, it becomes important. Now, understand tiger conservation in India is done under the Wildlife Protection Act. We have a concept called as tiger reserves itself. It falls under the Schedule 1 of the Indian law. International Union for, IUCN places it as an endangered species. CITES has put it under Appendix 1. So on the whole, this is quite important. Now, in India, we have a project Tiger that tries to overlook and give central assistance to those tiger states in India to preserve it in a good manner. And you also have NTCA, which was created under the Wildlife Protection Act Amendment of 2006. Until now, I have told you there was a 2002 amendment which gave rise to conservation and community reserves. There's a 2006 amendment which gave rise to your NTCA. And this NTCA, as you know, it's a statutory body because it came under the Wildlife Protection Act. This is the body that overlooks all of the tiger protection that happens in our country. It's under the NTCA that they have created, or they've asked every tiger reserve to create something called as Tiger Conservation Foundation, TCF. The state government shall establish a TCF for all the tiger reserves in that state, and all of the activities or the administrative activities, what programs they should do, all of those things should be determined by the Tiger Conservation Foundation. But again, to understand this, in India, not all the tiger reserves have constituted tiger conservation foundations. Okay, so TCF is a tool given by the Wildlife Protection Act, or Wildlife Protection Act gave rise to NTCA. NTCA asked every state government to establish TCF, but not all of them have established TCF. Okay, most of them have Kamlang, Orang, Pilibhit, Rajaji and Sri Villuputtur have not constituted TCFs, and this is considered to be problematic. Why? Because it will affect the day-to-day functions, what programs they have to do, that is not being overlooked by TCF in these bodies, and that is quite problematic because it's an administrative lapse. Now, in India, apart from this, we've created tiger reserves. Okay, Madhya Pradesh has the highest number of tigers. Now, these numbers I have already changed. I just want you to when we discuss the current affairs, I'll give you the new numbers which are there. The smallest tiger reserve in India is in Orang, and you also have several tiger reserves coming up in Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka. Now, this is where I want you to be acquainted with another concept called as critical tiger habitats. Okay, get this very clear. In India, some areas which have good amount of tiger population are declared as tiger reserves. Okay, are declared as tiger reserves. They are legislated under the Wildlife Protection Act. Now, there can be national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, etc., where they have tigers, but tiger is not the most important species over there. Okay, there might be other rare species, something. So in that case also, we have to preserve the tiger. You cannot be like, okay, yeah, tiger is important, but let's ignore it. That cannot be the case. So what happens is, in such national parks, etc., they look at where the tiger population is, and the Wildlife Protection Act declares certain areas as critical tiger habitats. This is important because there's a term very similar to it called as critical wildlife habitats that has nothing to do with this. That is a separate act. We will talk about that act also, but understand this is critical tiger habitats. And these are areas of national parks and sanctuaries which are required to be kept as inviolate for the purposes of wildlife conservation. It is determined and notified by the central government and after discussing with a expert committee. So which means what? These are areas that might not even be tiger reserves as it is. Okay, tiger reserves are there as a separate category. This is declared under the Wildlife Protection Act for those areas in national parks and wildlife sanctuaries where you do have tiger population and you cannot enter that area at all. So, for example, there's a wildlife sanctuary. You have livestock and grazing and everything. But if I am declaring a critical tiger habitat over there, I cannot have any activity over there. I cannot enter that critical tiger habitat. Clear? So, those areas were also declared under the Wildlife Protection Act. Now moving on to elephant reserves. Just understand, I am discussing this under the Protected Areas of Wildlife Protection Act, but it is not declared under the Wildlife Protection Act. Then how are these protection happening for elephant reserves? See, Wildlife Protection Act allows you to declare things as a national park, wildlife sanctuary, tiger reserve, conservation reserve, or a community reserve. These 5 things. You can declare that area as any of these things and say we have declared that for the protection of the elephant. Understand? So what happens is there is no concept of elephant reserves declared in any of our Wildlife Protection Act amendments or act or anything. What we declare is we declare an area as a national park or a wildlife sanctuary or a community reserve or a conservation reserve, and we say that we've declared it to preserve the elephants of that area. And this very colloquially, when we say, we call it as an elephant reserve. Why? Because this is that area is declared for the protection of elephants. Okay. Elephant, the species, is protected under the Schedule 1 of Indian Wildlife Protection Act. 16 of 28 states in India have elephant population, and we have also defined something called as Project Elephant in India in the year 1992. But understand, none of this declared an elephant reserve. What was said is that we can declare protected areas like wildlife sanctuaries or national parks or conservation reserves or community reserves for your elephant conservation. In this manner, we've declared few elephant sites, and we've also started monitoring. There was a program by CITES called as MIKE, monitoring of illegal killing of elephants. Now, as per this, what has happened is we have also declared certain sites in India as your MIKE sites. These are those sites where you have very severe illegal killing of elephants. Chirangripu, Deomali, Dihing Patkai, Garo Hills, Eastern Dors, Mayurbhanj, Shivalik, Mysore Elephant Reserve, Nilgiri Elephant Reserve, Wayanad Elephant Reserve, all of these were declared under, or these were all brought under MIKE idea. Again, but understand, MIKE is an international concept. MIKE is an international concept given by CITES. Why are we implementing it here? We are implementing it here because CITES is a legally binding agreement, and when you go and sign CITES, you should be ready to create laws and systems that will apply the CITES regulations in your own country. Got it? This is the reason why we have given, I wouldn't say the legal sanctity under Indian law, but then we protect this at the same severity as that of a national park or wildlife sanctuary. Okay? Now, as I also told you, the Wildlife Protection Act also created something called as your National Board for Wildlife. The National Board for Wildlife is a body established under the Section 5A of Wildlife Protection Act through the 2002 amendment. Again, we have the 2002 amendment. The Prime Minister chairs the body, and all the important decisions, alteration in the boundaries of national parks and wildlife sanctuaries, destruction or diversion of wildlife habitat, any of these things can be taken with the approval of your National Board for Wildlife. Then final body which is there, you have a Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, and Wildlife Crime Control Bureau was established in India as part of your CITES enforcement, which means what? CITES said that we have to curb illegal killing. So I told you, now if CITES is a legally binding treaty, what should we do? We have to come to India and we have to create some body that will be equivalent to doing CITES work over here. So what we created was Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, which came about under the Wildlife Protection Act, and I believe it is the 2006 amendment. Okay. Now we move into another act, which is your Environment Protection Act of 1986. The Environment Protection Act of 1986 was something that came about in India in the aftermath of your Bhopal gas tragedy. And the idea was that if at all any bodies are functioning in India, you have to not just look. So Wildlife Protection Act just looked at wildlife, one singular part, and its protection. Environment protection is a much more diverse body. You can see all the bodies created under it. We created something called as eco-sensitive zones, biosafety committees, Ganga protection bodies, environment impact assessment, ozone depleting substance rules, coastal regulation zones, Central Groundwater Authority. This is a multiple time asked question. So all of these bodies got created under your 1986 Act. Okay, could be several amendments, but understand, primarily the primary source is your Environment Protection Act of 1986. Now we have to look into detail about some of these things. The first thing that we have to discuss is your eco-sensitive zone. Eco-sensitive zone says that, see, whenever you are declaring a national park or a wildlife sanctuary, what happens is it is not always going to follow the pattern of that buffer area, transition area, etc. You can even just declare a national park. When you do that, the problem is you have national park, but maybe you have a population also living close by to it. So your Environment Protection Act said, see, why don't you do one thing? From the boundary of the national park, leave a certain area where those zones are eco-fragile zones or eco-sensitive zones, and you should avoid any kind of heavy development in those areas. Initially, the idea was to declare 10 kilometers from the boundary of your protected areas. It can be a national park, it can be a wildlife sanctuary, but 10 kilometers from the boundary of it, we declare an eco-sensitive zone. See, the problem is in India, when you put a law like this, in India, not all the forest areas are in a very pristine, secluded area. For example, the Western Ghats in India. You will see that the Western Ghats has so much of population dependent on it. The Western Ghats have people, if you have a protected area, you have people living very close by to it. 10 kilometers is quite a large area when it comes to a lot of these areas. So obviously it was taken to court, and then the court ruled that, the Supreme Court ruled that, okay, leave 10 kilometers. 1 kilometer should be considered as from the boundary should be considered as an eco-sensitive zone. But again, this was also controversial. Currently, the Supreme Court ruling on it is the fact that it is left to each state. You guys decide. You need to create an eco-sensitive zone. You can decide based on your conditions. Okay, so understand the concept came via Environment Protection Act, but now how much land can be declared is left to each state. Whoever can declare 10, whoever can declare 1 or less, whatever it is, it's left to each state's or each area's requirements. Okay, so this is the first thing that has come about, eco-sensitive zone. The next thing that the Environment Protection Act created were 3 bodies called as Biosafety committees. Understand, whenever we create any genetically modified substances, we do any research with genetic resources of plants, animals, etc., it can have an impact on the environment, because finally at the end of the day, we bring those plants and animals and we are cultivating it in the land. So it can have an impact on the other animals, other environment, etc. To look at the impact of it, we created 3 bodies called as Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, and Institutional Biosafety Committee. All these 3 bodies were created under the Environment Protection Act of 1986. Okay, so each of these bodies, I would say the prime body which is there, the most important one is your Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, and the other ones which are there are all helping Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee to do its job. Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee came about in the rules of 1989 that were created under the Environment Protection Act of 1986. As you know, if an act comes, they will create rules under it to implement it, right? So the act is 1986, the rules were of 1989. Okay, now moving forward, we also created several Ganga protection bodies. Right now, the Ganga protection body is called as National Council for Rejuvenating, Protection and Management of River Ganga. This is the body that we have currently there. Previously, it was called as National Ganga River Basin Authority. Now, it is renamed into this. The reason why it is now renamed in this manner is because previously it was just Ganga and the tributaries, but now it includes Ganga its tributaries, the states that are it's flowing through, all of these bodies are considered. So here you will see that National Ganga Council is basically looking at all of the states comprising River Ganga's basin. River Ganga's basin includes even its tributaries basin. That is Himachal, Uttar Pradesh, almost 10 major states come under this. Prime Minister is the ex officio chairperson of this council. That is your National Ganga Council. Now, as I previously told you, there was a Forest Conservation Act of 1980, and Forest Conservation Act of 1980 created 4 categories of forest, like reserved forest, village forest, protected forest and private forest. Previously, we had a 1927 Act that was, as you can see, it was a British Act that was there. We have replaced that with more conservation angle in 1980, and this is what we created. Here, I just want you to understand, when it comes to reserved forest, rights to all activities like hunting, grazing, etc. are banned unless specific orders are issued otherwise. So reserved is important. In protected areas, rights to activities like hunting and grazing are sometimes given to the communities. So if I had to have an assessment of amongst the reserved and protected, which is much more severe, the reserved is much more severe. Okay, it is much more, the criteria given for it is much more strict. Moving forward, we also have a Biodiversity Act of 2002. This is more or less much more important when it comes to science and tech, because what happens over here is, in a lot of areas in India, you have such genetic resources which might be taken from there and exploited in the sense that someone might figure out a very good use of it and everything, but they will not give any dues, or they will not compensate for the community which has cultivated that product. So this is what happens, and this concept is called as biopiracy, where your genetic resources are exploited and you do not get any benefit from it. Okay, so this biopiracy is what is curbed under your Biological Diversity Act. And here, as per the Biological Diversity Act, there are 2 major, let's put it like this. This is a previous year UPSC question also. Under the Biological Diversity Act of 2002, it created a setup called as National Biodiversity Authority, State Biodiversity Board, and Biodiversity Management Committee. Okay, Biodiversity Management Committee is at your local level. Okay, and it's created in local bodies. Each of these things tries to curb at that level, at that, what you say, when it comes to BMCs, it's at the local level. If anyone is exploiting any resources, if anyone needs to tap into any resources also, you need to first seek permission from BMC. And if it's a much more bigger project and everything, even subsequently to higher bodies. When it comes to your National Biodiversity Authority, it has the power of even a civil court, which means that if someone exploits your resources, you can bring them to picture under NBA, and NBA can impose penalties on them. NBA can punish them for pirating your resources. Apart from this, another current affair that is quite prominent for this year was also created by your Biological Diversity Act, and that is your National Heritage Sites, or your Biodiversity Heritage Sites. This year, there has been new sites declared. Gupteshwar Forest in Odisha has been declared as a new Biodiversity Heritage Site. Again, understand this is declared under your Biological Diversity Act. Okay, and understand here who can declare it? The state government can declare it in consultation with the local bodies, and when they declare it, this is something, what happens is, you are having a species that is very important over there, and you're declaring that area. And the important thing is, for example, sacred groves in India. You have those areas where you have snake worship, etc. Now you're able to do that over there because there is human activity also there. The humans are coming and doing some activities over there, so that, you know, even the ecosystem over there, the species over there are benefited from it. So in declaring a biodiversity heritage site, what you are in turn doing is, you are saying that let the human activity be there. We are not banning any human activity. Along with the human activity, let's conserve that area in a better manner. This BHS is declared under your Biological Diversity Act of 2002. Important fact for us. Moving forward, this is not ideally an Environment Act or anything. This is actually the Forest Rights Act of 2006. Looks at these issues from the human side. Until now, we were saying protect the wildlife, protect the biodiversity, protect the variety. But now, Forest Rights Act is a much more social legislation which says that, okay, you protect the forest. What happens to the people over there? Okay. Now, understand the more social impact of it and all is not important from the environment angle of it. One thing that's important from this angle is all the other acts that we've discussed till now was implemented by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Forest Rights Act is implemented by the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, primarily because it's from the people angle of it. And this is where I want you to be introduced to another term called as critical wildlife habitat. When you hear the word critical wildlife habitat, understand that critical wildlife habitat is declared under the Forest Rights Act of 2006. Critical tiger habitat is declared under the Wildlife Protection Act. Okay, critical wildlife habitat again does the same job. You are clearly demarcating an area and you're not letting people in over there. That is all the same, but the term critical wildlife habitat, it's not very animal specific. It's not specific to a tiger or an elephant or anything. It's all wildlife, and you're not allowed to have any human activities in over there. It's declared under your Forest Rights Act. The final act that we have to look from the environment perspective is your National Green Tribunal Act. Now, when it comes to the National Green Tribunal, understand this was enacted as per the Article 21 of our Constitution, and the idea is to, if any environment case is there, to dispose of the case within 6 months of getting that case. One pointer that I want you to remember over here is, majorly or if you have a case under any of the other acts, you can go to the NGT, barring if you have a problem under the Wildlife Protection Act, the Indian Forest Act, and various laws by Indian states for, state laws which are there. If you have any of these issues, you cannot go to the NGT. That's primarily because when it comes to Wildlife Protection Act and the Indian Forest Act, both of these things are, the crimes committed under these are not even civil nature, they are criminal in nature. That is first thing. Second thing, they have their own specific court processes for it. So you cannot bring it under your NGT. This is where you have to understand the NGT is not bound by the procedure laid under Code of Civil Procedure, which means that you cannot have your evidence-based things in your NGT, and both of these acts work on evidence base. That is why you cannot bring cases related to this under your NGT. Now with this, we have covered the wide range of static parts. You are done with all environment statics, the laws related to it. The next session that we have, we will be discussing the international organizations and the current affairs. Along with the current affairs, if any terms have to be taught to you, like, for example, pollution related terms or anything that is important for you, we'll be dealing with it. Okay, so with that, we are done with this first major chunk of environment that you need. For those who are very new to the subject, this is going to be more than helpful for you to just catch the concepts, to do basic elimination and basic answer searching. This will be helpful for you. Hope to see you in the next session. Please let me know if you are following these sessions. Are you able to understand these things? Are you able to answer the questions after going through these sessions? Let me know in the comments. I read all your YouTube comments, by the way. Okay, so that is something that I do because I need to know how my students are responding. So please do let me know. Thank you and have a nice day and happy learning.